how will it get the reachability to those areas which are still not having that much, probably the speeds of internet or the
I think that, well, it's a good question, right? So, and I think it's still pretty amazing, but a fact for all of us that, you know, in the US, we still have this pretty massive digital divide. You know, the advent of new technologies has been centered on areas of dense urban population. And it can take years. I mean, so I talked about a lot of great LTE stats, and as if it's done, urban America is still, you know, materially underserved in many, many geographies. And so I can speak for T-Mobile and our ambition. We new wireless spectrum that we secured in the 600 megahertz band from the FCC, 18 months ago. And we are using that spectrum in rural environments. And we've announced that we will take 5G services in that low-band spectrum to the nation as we move through 2020. And we're rolling out our LTE footprint with a low-band spectrum into more rural geographies in the US. And our commitment as a company is now to make those 5G services with passionate about. I really don't want to go into advocacy on our deal, but there's a much greater opportunity for us with Sprint to really bring the capabilities and benefits to rural America in a way. But it's a real focus point for us. I'm brutally aware of many parts of the country where broadband service is restricted to. And it does sound wacky to stand up here and talk about this incredible world of hundreds of megabits.
And around the distribution edge in consumer devices. And I think this is an important growing area of digital tech policy. Here's some of the remarks on the extent to which folks working in this area and on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give you a generic answer on, you know, the connectivity on the utility space right now, but it's obviously very rich. This world of IoT, if I can just double down, the connectivity capabilities on a 5G comments, but they're orders of magnitude greater than anything we can do in LTE today. And I love the opportunity with IoT to embed, be it farming equipment, be it water distribution equipment, whatever it might be, with a whole host of connectivity capability that is and information coming back from, be it your utility network, whatever it might be, at a very affordable cost and in a very affordable way. Those are big, big opportunities for, I think, all industries. And it's an area where we are working. We are looking to leverage our low-band rollout and our 5G network in that space, because it's a specific area where we believe we'll go first. There's been very few announcements about 5G and low-band, actually. We were one of the first companies actually globally to talk about that. Now it's being followed pretty heavily by most major operators around the world. And that is all about providing, I love to say, breadth of coverage. And so you can cover massive geographies and provide incredible connectivity that doesn't exist today. So I can't read that. I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses. You'll have... Time's up. Oh. Sorry, I couldn't read that. Any more questions? Can we do another?
One more question.
We'll do one more. Phil said one more. We can have one more.
Hi, Neville. Sue Merrick with Fierce Wireless.
Hello, Sue.
Do you think 5G is overhyped right now? We've got, you mentioned AT&T calling LTE Advanced 5GE. We've got Verizon with their pre-standard 5G. Is that just confusing the market?
I think from a consumer perspective, it's starting to get confusing, so, for sure. And I know you write a lot in this space. I think the 5G thing is going to be very confusing, and it's going to be detrimental to the rollout of true 5G. And we want customers to move into a 5G terminal with confidence that's a differentiated experience and not a 3-year-old technology that they're securing. And I do believe that there is some hype. Launches of 5G services announced in 2018, non-standards or standards-based, have been very limited in terms of geographic reach and capability and have gone very quiet. We, from day one, stood for something different. We've said when we have a 5G footprint, in the hundreds of millions of covered people, that's worth talking about. And that's been the goal of T-Mobile, and we've announced something we'll be delivering to the marketplace in 2020. That said, we will have 5G devices. We're rapidly building out the network, and we intend to be loud and proud about a real 5G solution in the second half of this year. But there is a lot of hype. There's a lot of confusion. I wanted to focus today on kind of the capabilities of these networks, not inside the next 6-12 months. Some of the IoT stuff is deliverable in those time frames, but really over the next 3 to 4 years. And 5G is just starting. But I do, and I'll wrap up my comments here, this capability, and I think the conference to touch on, I think we know we're behind in this wireless space. Massive platforms, this world of massive data moving around us and us partaking and participating in that in different ways we so choose. We're already behind in terms of really understanding the impact of that. 5G is going to take that to a very, very different level. Today we engage with the internet. We go read Twitter, we go download stuff, we pull down a movie. The world of the internet is going to get delivered to you in your eyewear, in your ear. It's going to happen real time in a fashion. The level of engagement, it's the next phase and era of the internet. And we can't do that in LTE today because of the latency limitations and some of the bandwidth limitations on these networks. But it's going to be there in 5G. And so we need to start thinking about that. That future's not here tomorrow, but it is going to be here as we move into the next decade, and way, way sooner than I think we may all be ready for it. And with that provocative comment, I'll shut up and I'll leave you to your conference. Thank you.
Yeah, he should put a flag. This can go in. Oh, it's okay. You have a slide? Come to the. Okay, could you ask Teresa to have.
I'm not giving a talk, but it might be useful.
Just a diagram. Just one slide. No audio, no nothing. Yes.
That's what I was going to say.
I missed it. I will be.
You can actually get going.
Oh, I should start. Okay.
I'm sorry I didn't give you the slides earlier when we prepared them 5 minutes ago. But
What did you got on that thing?
what do you need?
Let's see. Looks like we've got HDMI.
We'll do HDMI.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sophie Gallier, and I am the current editor-in-chief of the Colorado Law and Technology Journal. Colorado Technology Law Journal. Got to get the acronym right. It's changed a few times over the years. But I'm so excited to welcome everyone here. I think more than 17 years ago, a group of students and Phil started this conference, and we started putting it on as our flagship conference of CTLJ. And we are so excited to see what it has become. Over the past few years, I know many people in this room know that the term net neutrality was coined in our journal. Michael Powell's 4 Pillars of the Internet, that speech was coined in our journal. And looking through our symposium edition from last year, we are so excited. We're in the final moments of finishing it up as we realized we had a italicization problem with the periods. So our editors are currently going through and making sure that everything's perfect. Well, close to, as perfect as you can be. But we're going to be publishing Vince Cerf's keynote speech from last year about internet security. Ann Washington gave a great speech about bias and algorithms. Adam Thier gave a great speech about soft law and how it's equipped to govern changing technologies. And Christopher Yu sort of took a historical look at how we can look at history to make our security more robust. So those are the forthcoming articles. And then moving ahead to this year, this panel's, I just wanted to give our journal a quick plug. But Blake, you can feel free to supplement anything that I miss on the introductions. But we're very excited to start this panel with Blake Reed, who is our clinical professor here. He's done a phenomenal job doing work at the law school. I think his sort of bio speaks for itself. But he will be moderating the panel. We have Casey Claffey, who is the founder and director of the Center for Applied Sciences. David Clark, who is the Senior Research Associate Professor at MIT, and Jack Waters, who's the CTO for Zayo, and they will be talking about the changing, dynamics of platform dominance. So, are we set to go? I'm going to do one more quick. Sarah, who's been amazing, she's our CTLJ's incoming executive editor. She organized this entire conference and will be emceeing the conference from here on out. So I just want to give Sarah a quick round of applause as I pass over the mic to her for the future. And we're ready to go.
All right, we'll jump right in and get started. Wonderful to see everyone here today. This marks I think the 12th one of these that I've been to. I feel like I'm getting old here. But an occasion or thing about. Oops, is that good? Got it. Let's see. How's that? Okay. So on occasion all day, I had a chance to go back and look at some of the early volumes of the journal and some of our early conferences. And actually the very first article that we published in the journal back in 2003, it was an article by Phil Weiser called Information Platforms. And that was sort of a new idea back then, that term, information platforms. And so I thought this morning it might be profitable for us to discuss, since the theme for this conference is internet platforms, rising dominance and evolving governance, that maybe we should do some level setting on what internet platforms mean. The description of this conference sort of suggests that we might be talking about application platforms like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and the like. But the definition that Phil had in mind is perhaps a bit broader than that. And we've got folks who are involved in identifying some definitions in a technical sense that are a bit broader than that. So I wanted to open it up to David and Casey. Let's grapple with this idea of what is an information platform. Maybe I'll start with you.
Ha! It's interesting. I'm standing here because I'm waiting for this thing to either come alive or not. I wasn't going to show a video, but I would have put up one slide in answer to your question. But, life is, oh, dear. Platform is clearly an overused word. I think it's been used in some contexts where it means so many things it doesn't mean anything. I think a lot of the conversations we've had about dominance or market power, if you just delete the word platform from the conversation, it looks just the same. But there are some interesting specific definitions of platform that we found, and in fact, in hunting around, we found a couple that I think are substantially different, and I found people talking past each other because they didn't understand what they meant by the word platform. I think to an engineer, the word platform is a technology on which you build other technologies. So the operating system, Windows or Android OS or whatever, is a platform because you build apps on top of it. And then those are used in something else. And I have a picture here, if I can ever find it, that talks about the layers of the internet. And you can view each of those layers as a platform because people are building on top of them. There's a draft document, it's not out yet, unfortunately, but there's a draft document coming out of the OECD, which talks about platforms. And they have a substantially different definition of platform in there. They have equated platform to an online two-sided market. And they wanted to emphasize the two-sidedness. They specifically said something like Amazon Web Services is not a platform because it's not a two-sided market. You just put stuff on it. Where to an engineer, so it's a platform. So put stuff on it, you build on it. The essence of a platform is something you can build on top of. There was an extreme definition of a platform I found in one paper which basically said if it's programmable, if it's a platform, otherwise it's not. Well, it's obviously an engineer answering here. So I don't think we need to agree. We just have to understand what we're saying before we say platform. But if we ever get a picture here, I'll put up a picture that Casey and I drew several years ago, which is a layered, it's a picture of the access network as a series of layered platforms. And so, but try some other definitions here and see what you get.
Yeah, so let me open it up to Casey and Jack. What do you think about these competing definitions? Do we need to settle on one, or what are your thoughts?
Dave passed me a draft OECD paper that's going to come out in a couple weeks, I guess, where they have put in an appendix a typology of platforms. So, I mean, I think you can decide what you want it to mean in Alice in Wonderland space as long as you're consistent about what you want it to mean and that it's informing the conversation that you want to have. And I don't think from what I'm getting from the intro and the framing of this workshop, that the emphasis is on the platform. It seems to me the emphasis is on the dominance part. And so, but what's interesting to us and what we put in the platform paper that we wrote a few years ago was what makes the internet ecosystem arguably different, but I don't know enough about other ecosystems, is that the layeredness of the platforms, all the way from the physical layer to IP, I mean internet, the IP architecture itself, or the implementation of it, is a platform on which other things are built, applications are built. AWS is a platform, Facebook is a platform on which other things are built. But the ability to cross platform layers, which you see happen in the internet ecosystem, and in the old or what the way economics thinks about that is you use maybe dominance in one area of an ecosystem to establish dominance or leverage dominance in another area. I think the platform aspect, and I mean the layered, integrated with interfaces between platforms, the sort of technological platform aspect of the internet, both facilitates this crossing of platform layers, which can promote dominance quickly and stickily, because platforms are sticky, and also makes it harder in the internet ecosystem to assess it, to measure it. Now, dominance by itself isn't a harm, and so I keep coming back to the question of what is the harm that we're trying to address here. And the intro paragraphs on the page of this workshop talk about different regulatory or policy levers, tools to deal with the platform dominance, but I have a hard time, because I'm not a lawyer, mapping. Maybe lawyers have a hard time too, or it would be on that page, mapping the tool to the harm that we're trying to address. And so I think it's really critical, and I mean, I can list 10 harms that I come up with here that I see potentially happening in the ecosystem. All of them, I think a problem is measurement of the harm. I mean, you have identification of the harm and precise identification of the harm. measurement of the harm, and then mapping that to a tool that might address the harm, and then having some way to assess whether whatever tool you use actually made a difference in the harm. So sort of measurement of impact and correlation or causation, establishing causation between the policy tool or whatever tool you use, and reduction of the harm or increase of the good thing that you want to aspire to. So I know this panel is supposed to be sort of level setting of the technology, but I'm hoping that as we come back to these issues during the day that, and I might raise my hand and ask questions, we try to be as precise as we can about what is the harm that we're trying to address with this thing that we're talking about right now. So, talk about harms, and my background is internet measurement, computer science with some interdisciplinary aspects folded in, but really trying to measure the evolution of the ecosystem, the structure, the dynamics, the workload, the traffic, the topology, of which there's been dramatic changes over the last 10, 20 years. Most of them, I would argue, driven by forces of political economy, maybe policy forces too, decisions that are made in a regulatory context that drive behavior in the commercial context that then maybe establish new forms of dominance or reduce other forms of dominance. And so the question is, again, how does the technology inform, or how can the technology inform how you think about platform dominance, not just at this, as you say, application layer. I would argue Google is way more than an application platform. And when you talk about dominance, you don't necessarily mean at the application platform. In fact, I would argue that to some extent, any platform that I've heard people worry about the dominance of, it's not because it's a platform at one layer. It's because it's a platform that has crossed layers in some sense, or as the economics might say, moved into other businesses and leveraged dominance in one area to establish dominance, or at least threatened the stability or whatever. And maybe all that's a good thing. Maybe it's disrupted innovation. And that's why my home is measurement, so I keep wanting to say, okay, how would you measure that? And what is the tool by which you would try to manipulate that if you're trying to manipulate that? So I'll rattle off my harms. Discrimination. That's a classic harm, and that's where we get, when you cross a platform, then you have, when you own a certain platform and you establish a market at a platform above that, a layer above that, now you have the opportunity to perhaps discriminate, whether it's traffic or application discrimination. The App Store, there's been cases of, well, an app can't get in the App Store. Is there discrimination happening at the App Store layer? Or indeed economic discrimination, which is like the best way to discriminate, most effective way to discriminate. The big one we hear talked about is privacy. Privacy is, again, often when I drill down into a harm that is privacy, I find a platform layer crossing happening. So I think that's important to be thinking about. Is the platform layer crossing the thing that needs attention, or at least a way to have discourse about, which I think we have lacked thus far. And it's not just privacy, right? It's misuse of data, maybe, or potential misuse of data. In which case, again, how do we measure it? The transactions are pretty opaque right now. So maybe what we need first is to have some transparency to the transactions. How do you get there? And what harm might be imposed by even trying to achieve such transparency? Security, trustworthiness. Trustworthiness not just of the user, but even of the advertising side. How does the advertiser know that their advertising is being effective? There's a lot of opacity there. Price discrimination as another example of discrimination. Is perfect price discrimination a threat to open markets? That's getting talked about in economic circles lately. Monopoly pricing, obviously, we have some traditional old school harms. And then we have big, more abstract harms like freedom, autonomy, justice. I'm not saying they're too abstract. Indeed, those are the harms that we find wars getting fought over and revolutions getting launched, people dying over. But I still want to find a way to measure. To turn this into something that we could measure and then tie a tool to it. How would we know that tool is actually working?
So I want to pick up these questions of dominance and harm in some more detail, but I want to invite Jack into the conversation. So we've been over already defining platforms, and now we're starting to talk about problems. But anything to add to the platform definition piece?
I think the first question asked was, do you have to agree on what the definition of a platform? I don't know if it matters. I don't know if you have to agree. It's very perspective driven. We've always thought of platform as network, kind of originally, I think, is a reasonable place that we started. Probably Phil's paper, I haven't read it, but I assume way back in the dark ages when he wrote it, it had something to do with networks and ISPs and those sorts of things. The important thing, though, that I think that has happened is that platforms, whatever your definition is, they've developed and changed. There have been ones added over time. it's not to mean that any of the dominance issues have gone away for the ones that existed prior. And I think that many times people want to jump to, oh my gosh, are the social platforms suddenly a platform in which dominance, we need to worry about dominance now about those platforms and forget about all the other ones, because I don't think that's the case at all. That would argue that we somehow fixed something along the way. I'm not that I believe everything's broken either, but I certainly believe that we haven't fixed all of the original platform issues as well. And part of it, as I read the original premise of this discussion, you sort of jump to that, well, now we're just going to worry about the social platforms or the search platforms or whatever. The one thing I do believe, and very much my own personal opinion, is that the market has helped to decide. And probably as the resident capitalist on this panel every year, I do believe that. I do think that the market helps drive decision more than we would like it, or maybe this conference thinks at times. But I do think if you go back and look at companies and that we worried about probably 50 years ago, what was the company we worried about the most 50 years ago having dominance?
AT&T.
IBM? AT&T? Do we still worry about those two companies as having? And I would actually argue more about IBM than AT&T, because you could argue that, MFJ made that go away. But put AT&T to the side for a second and look at the companies that had dominance like IBM.
So, Jack, let me take your invitation here to go back to some of these original problems. And Dave, in your 1984 paper where you articulated some of the layer stack that you alluded to, one of the concerns that was obviously motivating that paper was the dominance issues in the telecommunications industry and the computer industry, and thinking about how do we design a network that doesn't put control entirely in the hands of a dominant provider. Do you see those issues as still being salient today? And maybe that's an obvious question, because we just had an oral argument about net neutrality. But how do you see those issues materializing today, and if they're different in any way than they were back when we started this enterprise?
1984 was a long time ago. I don't know that we need to go all the way back there to figure out what's going on here. Let's just say, let me try a few thoughts and see how this works. And I'm sorry, I got to talk for a while. This next person's trying to get my talk, and I sent her the wrong talk, and this is just sort of like,
Get there.
don't worry about it. But the fact that the internet was going to be built out of networks, that it's a net of nets, which, as you begin to think about how the network's actually constructed by organizations as opposed to engineers, means it's an internet built out of organizations. How many autonomous systems are there these days?
70,000.
70,000. In that context, you get a particular perspective on dominance, I think. But it's not like there's one company that sort of controls the internet as a platform. And we tried very hard, although I don't think we understood it thoroughly in the very beginning, to try to define the interfaces between ISPs so that you could effectively get this co-opetition. And again, in the beginning, we weren't thinking about the commercial issues as much, so we weren't thinking about the competitive aspect. We were thinking about it more as a cooperative aspect, but we understood the pieces had to fit together. And that's both a power and a constraint, because it's those interfaces that define how the ISPs interconnect that, in some sense, constrain what the service is. The power of centralization here is something that really needs to be understood. I think if you talk to most computer scientists, they will say, if you could build a centralized solution to this problem, it's always easier. if you look at the email system and you say, well, all these distributed modes around, all these email servers, and then they all have to talk to each other, and they talk to each other using a well-defined protocol, and that's wonderful. Except, of course, to evolve the email system, you may have to evolve that protocol. It's a very slow process. If email is just run by one company, then if they want to change it, they can just change it, for better or worse. So the trend of centralization, which in some sense can't happen at the internet layer because ISPs actually exist as entities on the face of the earth. I mean, you can't have one company like AT&T or Google or Comcast suddenly take over China. I mean, that doesn't happen. So the question in that context, what does dominance mean? I would say that we've had a lot of concerns about the access ISPs and whether they have market power and whether there's enough competition there, but I don't think that's a consequence of architecture. That's a consequence of the reality of the cost of building facilities. And Casey and I often argue about whether a different architecture for the internet could produce an outcome, but I don't see how to change the economics of facilities. Unless the only way you're going to get competition there is among people who either have their own facilities or have been given access to somebody's facilities, usually through a regulatory intervention. But at a higher layer, where you look at something like Facebook, well, it's just much easier to build a centralized Facebook than to define all the protocols so that you can break it up into parts and all the things still works. And by the way, of course, it becomes easier to monetize and it becomes easier to control and exploit, whatever words you want to use. And obviously in the context of something like a Facebook, which is we built a network, so it shouldn't be surprising that on top of the network you get network effects. You sometimes get strong market tipping. And, I don't want to be the only person owning a fax machine, and I don't want to be the only person on Facebook, so it tips. And in some sense, none of this should surprise anybody. The question is, what do you do about it? But there's nothing unnatural about the push toward a centralized solution to a problem when it works, and a push toward a realization that you may get this convergence toward a winner-take-most outcome. Were we thinking about this in 1984? I don't even think that's a relevant question, if you see what I mean. I think some of this snapped into focus pretty quickly in the 90s when we started to see commercialization, but, there was sort of a hint in one of the documents here that, we should now start worrying about dominance at higher layers. And if you brought Tim Berners-Lee in here, who invented the web, he would have started screaming at you. And he would have said, for 10 years, I've been railing about the fact that there are really adverse consequences from these very centralized implementations of some of our critical applications. And he's been pushing really hard to try to understand how he could make something like a distributed social network system along the same sort of, just think about the distributed email system. There's lots and lots of little servers, and my social net's here, and social net's there, and somehow they all talk to each other, and we can build all the protocols such that all these pieces fit together. And there have been lots of efforts to try to do that. There's the thing that Tim did, which is called Solid, and there's Diaspora and so forth, and guess what? They haven't gotten traction, and the reason they haven't gotten traction is that's really a much harder way to do it. And the centralized solution is much easier because you don't have to define those protocols, the protocols don't constrain the evolution of the product, but all of a sudden, now you have a global player. When did we sort of understand this? Well, it's certainly, if Tim would have said, we fully understood it 10 years ago, and we should have been dealing with it back then.
But I think one of the differences is I think about, if you think about it from the end user's perspective, the network effect of dominance or whatever on a social platform is because one person chose it, then two people chose it, then a third, and a fourth, and it built somewhat by its own popularity, if you will. I don't know a better word to think of it. Whereas the original concerns around network dominance weren't because the end user chose. In many ways, the end user goes in for themselves, and until the advent of this, did you end up with some modicum of choice. But prior to that, when you think about the concerns around dominance around networks, it wasn't, much of it came because of the fact that you did not get to decide as the end user who your platform was, which I think is a huge difference between today's concern around platform dominance and the dominance that happened whenever ago.
So Jack, I want to pick on that question a little bit. So we have, with the internet, some level of decentralization, but users funneled into particular modes, whether it's DSL in the early days or cable modems, or whatever the technology may be, they were sort of forced into it. On social networks, maybe users have choice at the outset, but then get funneled in with network effects. When we've got the level of dominance that builds up, what do you see as the difference for how it formed? Should that inform our policy thinking in any way, or does that inform the diagnosis of the harms that Casey talked about, or are we dealing with the same problem?
I think the end result kind of ends up being the same. Your harms were a good list of harms. But I mean, from an operator perspective, I look at the way you got there and say, one was, you could argue the nice way of just competition, a great idea, and look what happened. You kind of ended up with something that you still have this concern about. The other way is you got 100 years head start from a commitment that came in the early 1900s, or you were lucky enough to win a cable franchise in the early days of cable, and you got a lot of wind in your sail on the way. And I think maybe the way you got there, where you got to may be the same thing. You're still worried about pricing. You're still, something that no one ever talks about, and I didn't really understand it until I read about it, was monopsony power. Which is all you lawyers are laughing. I'm a simple engineer from West Virginia, so I don't know about all this complicated law stuff. But that's an interesting one that doesn't come up much. But the notion that somebody who has incredible selling power also has incredible buying power, that one jumps out as a newer concern in this platform discussion of dominance that I hadn't really thought about, and I sell a lot of stuff, so maybe I should have thought about it, but boy, how would you like to be a seller of compute or storage to one of the 4 nexuses, purchasers of compute and storage in the world right now that buy 90+% of all compute and storage? Would you feel like monopsony power might be something that you'd be a little concerned with?
Yeah.
So let's pick up on this issue of harms, and I know Casey, you alluded, we'll be talking about this all day, and you laid out a taxonomy of discrimination, privacy, security, monopoly, pricing. Let's see, freedom and justice.
Can I have that list?
I just wrote that up there, so that might not be complete.
Can't forget about freedom and justice, very important. Responsibility is going to come up later. Let's dig into these harms, and from your perspectives as technologists, and Casey, maybe start with you, what do you see at any of the platforms, and I leave it to you to identify them, what do you see as the most salient concerns, and how do you know, to your question about how do we measure these things, what are you worried about?
This panel, no. So I'm an academic scientist, so I'm more about, I'm really trying to study the field. So if you ask me what I worry about, I try to catalog what do I see people worried about, and how are they measuring it, which is usually not that well. So I'll just, rather than have a personal position here, I'll just try to pick the one at the top, pick the one that everybody talks about, privacy right now. That's the big thing with the data mining and advertising, and how do we approach it? I mean, I think that the reason that one is getting a lot of airtime now is it's huge, it's pervasive, it sort of permeates everything, but it's also pretty abstract. And it's very difficult at this point, and as Dave observed with Tim Berners-Lee, like he might have predicted 10 years ago this was going to be a problem, sort of dominance over information flows, maybe you could think about it. And that it is not obvious at this point, since, how does he say, people have been asleep for 10 years, 20 years, how to think about even beginning to addressing the harm, or even measuring, or even describing it. And what are you going to do? The people are talking now about privacy regulation. GDPR taking a swing at this. I guess academics will wait a year and find out what the impact was. How do you measure the impact of GDPR on whatever the harms were it was trying to address? And if some other country tries to do something else, how can it learn from that to try to do better the next time? But I think we underestimate, especially Jack, who said markets have spoken. Markets have definitely spoken, and I don't think Dave and I are so anti-capitalist. I mean, we like cheap stuff too. So, but I think the underappreciated part of history is how much of the industry structure was designed before the markets got in. I mean, the NSF and DARPA before that, the US government was basically managing, funding, administering, operating the internet for 30 years before the markets have spoken. And indeed, they more or less designed the markets to speak that way. I mean, we did see evidence that there was commercial interest. And of course, the reason DARPA got out of the business in the 80s, and NSF, National Science Foundation came in, was DARPA realized, well, there's non-defense people using the network. That's not really what DARPA money's for. And including a lot of our universities using the network, maybe even a little bit of commercial stuff. But the real uptake at that point was universities were getting huge value out of the network. So the National Science Foundation said, hey, that's us. Maybe we can do it. And the National Science Foundation took over the backbone, at least the core part of the infrastructure, for at least 10 years, upgraded it a few times before it was clear that no, now there's some substantial commercial use of the network to talk to people at universities, like Apple, doing research with Stanford or UCLA or something. At which point the NSF realized, and others, made the clear point, well, we shouldn't be competing with, we shouldn't be perpetually operating in the telecommunications sector. There's enough commercial interest bubbling up now that we should get out of the business. But they did it quite carefully. In fact, I was part of the R&E network community at that time. I was at UCSD doing my thesis, my PhD thesis on internet traffic characterization. Thank God there was actually some data. You can't do that thesis now. There was some data because the National Science Foundation mandated there be data about the NSFNet backbone provided so that NSF would have some idea about the growth of the network and how it was being used. And so the NSF orchestrated a transition to take the backbone away, but it didn't want to partition the network because the backbone was the thing that enabled the commercial sector to come forward, because you would connect to the backbone and you'd have a way to get to the other networks that the protocol was allowing you to get to. And in doing so, it made sure the regional network, the academic regional networks, that it was still funding at that time. It would ramp down their funding over the years, basically saying you have to go make your own money. You have to go get revenue from the commercial sector. But it would only give it would ramp down its allowance from the government for a few years until it was gone. But it would only even give it that allowance if those networks promised and committed to stay connected to some exchange points that would enable this or prevent this partitioning from happening, the harm being partitioned. So there was total industrial policy in the 80s and 90s to make the internet, the ISP layer, be as competitive as well. We can see how well that worked out in the end, but it was the objective. I think they achieved the objective. It was a fantastic example of industrial policy. They did the same thing a couple of years later with ICANN.
Hold up,
that's another conference. We can talk about metrics of success for ICANN, but they exactly wanted to create a competitive industry in domain name provisioning, and they did. And they had metrics of success, and they tried to enforce transparency and accountability, and has multi-stakeholder and blah, blah, all these things we now know, and there's whole conferences dedicated to that, I guess. But I think what's interestingly different about today's concerns about the platform dominance, the platform ecosystem, the application layer and above, and the advertising ecosystem, none of that happened. There was no industrial policy. The government was back in the road of, okay, we've let the internet go off, and now we're going to just let it grow organically, let the free markets take care of it, as they have done very well. But now we're wondering, oh, maybe we need a little bit of oversight. Maybe we need a little bit of thinking about what are the potential harms. And I think the challenge is going to be, how do you do it now? Because what are you going to do? Okay, step one, figure out what the harm is. Like, okay, we need more transparency into the transactions that are happening in the ecosystem that fund the advertising, which is funding a huge amount of services. That we love these free services. But we don't understand, or some argue, we don't understand the nature of the transaction with the data that we're giving up to enable these services. How do we get more transparency into that transaction? Would it really work to have a GDPR-like thing that makes sure that every time I turn data over to one of the companies that's using the data, and it's not just these big platform companies. Sure. Almost every app is doing this, right? This is the major business model for providing us services on the internet. If we want more insight into the nature of that business model in order to analyze the harms of that business model, how do we get it? Because, as Dave would argue, giving each individual user some insight into where that data goes and how it's being used, not clear that that's going to scale or how it would work. Maybe what you would need, like the kind of thing that the government designed in the 90s for the DNS, is some industry players that do that sort of thing for you, that do that sort of analysis and become your proxy for, these are what my constraints are with respect to privacy. This is what I care about. This is what I don't care about. This is what I'm willing to have monetized as much as they want. And then have those players do that for me. Unclear how you would get there now.
So let's pick up this question of industrial policy shaping outcomes. We could even look at privacy in networks and look at the FCC's protections with its CP&I rules and all of that sort of thing as providing some protection, although that's been eroded pretty significantly in the last couple of years. If we go further up the stack where we basically have got very little foundation, or to the extent we have any foundation, we have things like Section 230, things like Section 512 of the DMCA that are pretty enabling for platforms to go out and do exactly the kind of things that you're talking about. How do we go put the genie back in the bottle if we see that there are significant harms? Is that something we can do? Is that something we should do? David, what do you think?
Don't think the genie goes back in the bottle.
What did you say?
Don't think the genie goes back in the bottle.
I don't think the genie
But step one, identify harms. Step two, think about how you would measure them. Right? And that's where these conferences are important, because these particular harms are very much having technology and policy embedded together, and we don't speak the same language.
I think there was an article distributed. I don't know whether you did or you did, but a Economist article about the fact that today, everybody thinks there's stuff is free, right? As a consumer, you think, I use Google or I use Facebook or whatever, right? Don't mean to pick on them, great customers. But to the consumer, it's free. But what the article argued was to the consumer, they don't understand that their data is in fact the currency. And that is something that I think is missed on, maybe not to this room, but certainly to the average consumer. How much does your data play in as currency for these platforms? And that's something that I think is misunderstood, if not if understood at all, to the average consumer. To your point, or to the point that she said you would say, maybe if you provided enough data, consumers would care. It'd be so much you wouldn't know what to do anyway. But I do think that that's a pretty fundamental thing that I believe today consumers don't understand how much their data is in fact the currency for these platforms.
Well, and we explored this topic at our advertising and privacy conference a couple of years back. It's not entirely clear that advertisers fully appreciate that either. And
they just think they're smart and deserve all those incredible profits?
Yeah, and that sort of the currency is being created by the Googles and the Facebooks of the world telling advertisers that this is worthwhile. And that in fact, when we start to unpack that, maybe that isn't true. So maybe one last question to leave us with here, and then I'll turn to a student for the first question. Let's say that goes away, either through privacy regulation or transparency regulation of some sort.
That what goes away?
That the ability to monetize all of these services with data. Let's say that gets undermined. What's next? What results can we?
So I was going to make a prediction,
yeah.
And it's only in part driven by concerns like the erosion of ad profitability due to GDPR. But the people who are going to be the most efficient at capturing ad revenues are going to capture them. And you look at somebody like Facebook, who's managed with all these little like buttons and so forth, basically keep track of everything. They don't have to be part of some large advertising ecosystem. They know everything. And I think that we may discover that large parts of this free environment simply no longer survive on the ad revenues. And it was in the 1990s, Hal Varian said to me, the internet is about routing money, and routing packets is a side effect. And so here's the question. Who designs the money routing protocols? Because that's industrial structure. And I will tell you, the IETF will not design money routing protocols. They just scream and run away in panic because that's engineering industry structure and they think that's outside their scope. So who's going to design the money routing protocols? Is it going to be a dominant player? Or is it possible that a more distributed architecture for routing money could actually trigger a significant shift in what the economic ecosystem of the internet looks like over the next 10 years? There's a little tiny example I like to offer people, which is actually a for-profit firm called Patreon, where people who are doing things that are definitively non-commercial, artists, creative people, can basically put Patreon on their website, and it's a way for people to say, I like what you're doing, I'll give you a little money. And it makes it really easy. There's just a give money button, and Patreon, of course, is taking their fraction of this whole thing. But there are non-commercial creative people who say, I can now make a living. And they just stepped away from advertising. It has nothing to do with this. The consumer of their product is willing to pay for it. So Patreon created a money routing protocol. Okay. But I think you should ask that in a very abstract way. And is there going to be dominance in how new money routing protocols come into focus as we see what may be the erosion of this? By the way, if you take the total online advertising spend in the United States and you divide by the number of online people, it works out to about $25 a month. Now, we're worth a lot more because this is a room full of wealthy people. I got lawyers here, right? Or maybe the students, you just hope you'd be wealthy. So we're probably worth a lot more than $25 a month. And so there's a fairness issue here. Should the wealthy be paying for the less, oh my God, that sounds like taxation. But this is all about money routing. But it's important to have an order of magnitude. What are we talking about here, right? The total ad spend in the United States these days, online ad spend in the United States these days, is about $80 billion. That's the same as Comcast top line. We're not fighting over a lot of money here, guys. You know?
It's running out. There's only so much of that. But I want to push back on, let's assume we do something about the advertising. Advertising has been supporting services for way longer than the internet, right? Newspapers, radio, media, forever. We like that unless we want to pay for bad TV. So it's not about the advertising, and that's why I want to keep coming. Advertising is not on my list. It's privacy, and even that is abstract. That privacy is kind of like freedom and justice. It's misuse of data, and until we can even determine there's misuse of data, I mean, we all have some idea that there's data being used in ways that we're not comfortable with, but we can't quantify that. I think what we need first is transparency into what the transactions are like, to Jack's point.
Yeah.
And my argument is the academics are not going to save you on that. The academics cannot give you those research papers because there's data missing. That's true of almost all things about the internet. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but in particular for this privacy issue, we need to decide what sort of data do we need and how do we get it to inform the analysis before we even talk about remedy.
I think if your question, even if that were all to go away, I'd love the example of I think that there's always going to be a dominant player in a market.
In any market?
In most. I'm sure you could come up with examples.
Automobiles.
And it goes up and it will ebb and flow. I mean, Sears, the greatest example ever. Sears had market dominance in retail. And not just retail walking into shops, but the internet of its day, mail order. Sears is now flirting with its third time through bankruptcy. I believe that markets, are always subject to dominance, and hopefully in our free market, you get a new idea. That new idea is better than the last one. It has, its certain attributes, and it pushes forward. And I mean, that's what I think. If it were to go away, it'd be something else.
closing on that Schumpeterian note, I'll open it up to audience Q&A. As always, the first question goes to students, and I'm looking over here because I see some folks in the front row that I'm not afraid to cold call, but I'll take a volunteer for about 10 seconds before I invoke that.
I'm going to call on you, for God's sake.
Quieted everyone down.
Sarah.
Hi, so Sarah Rippey, I'm a 2L here. So my question is with regard to transparency, and does it presuppose that people care about how their data is being used to the extent that they know that it's their currency? And how do you structure it so people, like for the GDPR, for example, going in and clicking, yes, I consent to this, people would rather use the website than just click
But that's the issue. That is in fact the issue. People, I believe that in many cases people don't know enough to care.
I believe that in all cases, people are not actually reading what they click through.
Oh yeah.
So how do you
You guys
solve
are
that,
writing
though?
them much too complicated.
How do
They
you
need to be
solve that?
cartoons.
It's one thing to require that they're given the opportunity to, but how do you turn around and make people actually read what they say they're reading?
Okay, so that goes to the point I was making earlier that I don't think the end users solve this problem. I think that you could argue the next killer app is privacy if people care about that, and there will be companies that emerge to offer to do the service for you if you care. And it will start out with organizations, companies, I don't know who analyze the problem first. But how do you analyze the problem today?
Well, and just to foreshadow for later in the day, we'll debate about whether we ought to consider that through an economic lens, or the correct view, which is maybe we should look at it through something else. Sorry, I'm moderating that debate, I hope. Other questions from the audience? Paul.
Paul Ohm, I'm part of that debate, so this is impolite for me to take more time. But so, Casey, I've never heard this like measurement fetishism that you were just displaying here, and I just want to understand where this is coming from. So the law always deals with harms that are difficult to measure. I've been scribbling a bunch down. Emotional distress, harms to the environment, harms to democracy. We come up with statutory damages for things that are difficult to measure. Even if you restrict yourself to privacy, we have laws that worry about anxiety, embarrassment, fear, regret, loss of control. We have the Wiretap Act, which doesn't require a measurable harm. We have the Privacy Act, which we could debate it. We have Do Not Call, which is about the annoyance when the phone rings during dinner. Why do we have to have a measurable thing be such an important part of what we decide we can solve or not solve on these platform problems? Why can't it be a problem that we all agree is a significant problem, and maybe here's some tools to correct it? Why does the loss of a measurable quantity have anything to do with our analysis?
How are you guys doing with antitrust?
Sure, I mean, antitrust, right, would be wonderful if we could extend it to things that are hard to measure. Absolutely.
I would argue measurement is a huge problem there. If you're trying to use the consumer welfare standard,
right,
and one of your prongs is the price to consumers going up, and you're analyzing companies that largely give you services for which the price is completely opaque, but it's zero if you have to put a unit on it today, your doctrine is failing you.
So you're preaching to the choir. So antitrust should be premised on things that are not measurable. I'm with you. Okay. So we should break up companies that violate privacy. I agree. I think that's what you just said. I think that's what you just said.
No.
All right, I'm going to give up the mic.
I'll see you later in an alley, Paul.
So I mean, let's keep this question going for one more second. It's the closest person maybe to a hipster on the panel. We've taken this up in antitrust, right? And we've got a new school, or maybe it's an old school of antitrust that says we really shouldn't obsess about measurement in the way that we have, and we need to start thinking about dominance in terms of size as a problem, or dominance in terms of dignitary harms.
It's not on my list. Dominance is not on my list. That's the problem.
Let me try. Since you said hipster, I don't know whether we really want to go there. Lightning may come out of the sky, but it's not size in that context. It is arguable harms that are being exacerbated by size, right? So let's just say, okay, you said hipster, I'll say Lisa Kahn, and She talks, what?
Lena Khan.
Lena Khan, excuse me,
I
Lena Khan. Not here by any chance, is it?
Is she? She wouldn't dare.
Who talks a lot about Amazon, and a lot of what she talks about is not dominance of a platform, but the fact that Amazon has inside it lots and lots of lines of business which can be cross-connected and correlated. And so they could, for example, use data about what you're buying, not just to do first-degree price discrimination against you, but also to figure out how to harm some of their competitors. Okay? And so you go after that through antitrust. I mean, somebody here said CP&I, and I think there was an interesting blog by Harold Feld who said the idea behind one of the very specific ideas about the privacy embedded in Title II, which is CP&I, was that telephone companies could not use the data they got from you to harm their competitors. So why doesn't that apply to any platform? Okay? That's not an antitrust remedy. That's not a break it up into little pieces remedy. That's an identified harm. Here's a kind of a rule you could apply. And so I think I think if you think about hipster, you shouldn't think about it narrowly as should we try to reinvigorate the specific, perhaps old interpretation of antitrust. And I'm not a lawyer, so I think she was asking a deeper question than she was asking, which is there's some real harms here, and should we acknowledge that maybe they're hard to figure out how to address, but is the difficulty of addressing them through antitrust the fact that antitrust just doesn't happen to have the right tools, or are the difficulties more intrinsic, and are we actually just going to go face a hard problem? And maybe, even if you wrote a new law, it would still be complicated, but that doesn't mean we can ignore the harms. So
We have to identify them.
but you have to
So
identify
Paul, maybe measurement doesn't have to be very quantitative and unit-driven, but we at least need to identify them precisely and not just say privacy.
Have something we can debate over, but whether or not you can measure it, it would be nice to have.
Okay. Well, measurement writ broad.
All right, I think we've got time for at least one more question. Connor?
Yeah. So I had a question. So I think it was Tristan Harris who I first heard refer to, we're in this changing model going away from advertising, that we might end up with kind of a two-tiered consumer market where people who have the education and bandwidth to think about what they're clicking through and the disposable income to engage more subscription-based services might not be susceptible to a lot of these harms that will then be kind of shunted onto a lower-class consumer market, emphasizing class divides. Is that something you're worried about at all or have thoughts on?
It's sort of true now, I think. And so, and here's where measurement, and I know Remy calls Harrison in, but does the ecosystem or do certain platforms exacerbate that problem? In which case, now you have to measure, because you're talking about a degree.
Maybe.
And how much is too much?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say, the development of the infrastructure, you could certainly make the argument that it's done more to eliminate classes as much as create them. So I don't.
Or expand the middle, yeah.
Yeah, you make a strong argument in both directions. I don't know if I could get there. That it's obvious that that's what's going to happen. It certainly could. I think Neville was talking earlier about we still in this country we still have a great divide for just basic things like broadband. It kind of seems crazy given where we started. So maybe, but I would say, in my opinion, the pluses of the platform that's been created over the last 20 years has done as much to eliminate classes as anything to create them.
Well, again, those are opposing, maybe not even opposing, but those are two different forces. I would say the force of connectivity and enabling accessibility to information, and then the force of information doesn't really want to be free. That higher quality information is going to cost money, and to the extent that I may end up having to go pay journalists to go find out what journalists I trust, and so I'll pay them to go tell me, okay, which of these news is fake and which of these should I really read, and that's what blogs are. That's what sources of journalism are today. So I think that it's straightforward that force will exist. To me, it's inevitable.
So can I offer a slight tweak on this question? Neville suggested a lot of new technologies that are coming down the pike, and we've been talking thus far about platforms that exist right now, but we're going to see a lot of new ones come down the pike that are going to bring new benefits and maybe bring new problems that we haven't thought about. Should we be thinking about, Jack, to your earlier formulation, Casey, I'm sorry, maybe you said this, about industrial policy. Is there industrial policy we should be putting in place before these things come out to guide their development, to maximize benefits, minimize harms?
Should we do it when the government is open or when the government is closed?
We've got a week, so.
Let's do it this weekend.
All right, let's take one more question.
They don't pay any.
That wasn't a real answer.
She's learning. She holds up a time up sign and you say one more question.
Hi, Jane Bambauer from the University of Arizona. So I'm still having trouble understanding the market failure of these social networks, or of the network effects under the conditions of a social network, because traditionally when we've worried about network effects, it's because somebody has to invest in the fax machine or invest in the television set, and they can't buy multiple machines, and so they're sort of stuck with their network. But in social networking, I don't even see, there can be multiple networks that everybody has access to, and they don't have to talk to each other. So this is, I guess I'm directing this question kind of to David. They don't have to talk to each other. They can compete in some sense. And then other than possibly the information failure that Jack talked about, I don't quite understand what keeps a consumer locked in against their will into one social network when they can be on Snapchat and Facebook and Friendster or whatever. So could you please elaborate?
Well, I'm not an expert in that space, but I have an intuition, which is that the cost is not the dollar cost of buying your fax machine. It is the investment you make in creating the profile that you have in that space, and the fact you can't easily extract that and put it someplace else. So, those of us who, I'm in on LinkedIn, but I haven't cared much about my profile. I'm not looking for a job. But you put a, but you put a lot of time developing that profile. It's a different profile than you have on Facebook, but you can't pry that out. So I think the stickiness is, again, it is a tipping effect. If somebody came along and somebody built a new, MySpace 2, like that.
Like Google Plus?
That's harsh.
Just
That's harsh.
Just sticky. I think there is just a lot of inertia, and it's but the point is you wouldn't pay in dollars to move, you'd pay in time. So I have 7 different telecommunication packages on my computer. She likes Zoom. She likes this week. Yeah, and it's trivial for me to install them. There's not a lot of cost. So I think it'd be really hard for one of those to establish dominance. And Facebook gives me free software. Skype gives me free software. I think it's the difference is the investment you make as creating your part of that space that you make it sticky.
I certainly wouldn't say that there's been a market failure yet, which I think was kind of fundamental to your question. I don't think we've seen, I personally don't think we've witnessed a market failure yet. I think if I had a concern, it's to the tipping point, which is there a tipping point where there is no next way of if someone holds all the information, how does anyone else ever start? And I think that probably more than anything would be the concern I have. I don't know if we've seen that, and certainly history has proven that that's not the case. When you look at the MySpaces, whoever else, and the Google, I'm using that, the Google Plus. That's awesome.
Why is that? Why does that not?
Well,
Plus would have been or Instagram,
but it didn't happen. I'm just saying. But do you think it's already happened? Do you think it's already happened? Do you think it's already happened?
How do you measure? What's your threshold?
My point last, if you give me enough time.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm gonna bring us to a close. We'll be back in about 10 minutes with Commissioner Chopra. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our top panelists.
All right, if I could have people's attention. We are gonna have a chance to visit again after our panel. But before our panel, we have a special treat. Federal Trade Commission, and before that, worked at Consumer Financial Protection Board. CF, gotta keep our acronyms. In business and regulatory policy. Was Dennis Yao the last lawyer on the FTC?
Orson Swindle and Dennis.
Who now lives in Colorado, by the way. And Dennis. And the original vision of the FTC was to bring together different disciplines. Help develop lawful policy, and those who followed, say, he has clearly ready to roll with lots of interesting and important ideas and discussion at one point. I asked him to come share a few thoughts. So with that, Commissioner Chopra.
Thank you. So, first, congratulations to General Weiser, and it is good to know that there are more informed and smart attorneys general who care about these types of issues, and I have no doubt that you all will be playing an outsized role as we confront many of the challenges we face. So thank you all for having me. It wasn't long ago when the stories that we would read about technology were almost uniformly positive, for the better, and new products and services were making us saving us time, opening up new possibilities. And the leaders of these companies, culturally and philosophically, were self-described disruptors, looking to put their users first and cut out the middleman. But obviously today we read and hear different, especially when it comes to some of our largest in the technology sector. The startups of years ago are now large and powerful entities. Seven of the top 10 largest publicly traded corporations by market capitalization are either an American or Chinese technology. They are no longer small and scrappy, but often use their considerable clout to seek favorable contractual terms with users and suppliers. Many of these firms, as already been described, are now able to map our minds by harvesting massive amounts of data. Journalist Julia Angwin, how one of these firms could quote build a complete portrait of a user by name, everything they write, every website they visit, and the searches they conduct. And more and more Americans are waking up to this reality, and they have questions, and they need answers. So enforcers like attorneys general, and federal agencies are rightfully thinking more, focusing more attention on whether these firms are living up to the existing laws on the books, and legislatures in states, including the United States Congress, are also looking to investigate. And so today I want to outline three threats and challenges we must wrestle with respect to today's tech sector. First, fair economic competition. Second, to our civil rights. Third, to our democracy. First, we need to investigate how technology platforms and their impact on economic competition. Now, Turbocharging competition and innovation was a key promise of an increasingly digital world and an open internet. If you wanted to make or sell something, you wouldn't have to go through gatekeepers and middlemen. And 20 years ago, we started to see online offerings truly take off for consumers. But many of the earliest popular online offerings saw their fortunes dry up when a better competitor emerged. That's how it's supposed to work. When you don't have gatekeepers and barriers. And investors and entrepreneurs saw this. Many of them knew that to truly hit the big pay, they need to create an essential utility or platform that just could not be easily unplugged. They would need to expand their horizontally, vertically, and diagonally. First, by dominating functions, leveraging those functions into market platforms, and then embedding those across the internet and in software and devices. This strategy couldn't be executed solely through their own innovation in many cases. It would also rest on an acquisition strategy. Firms seeking dominance saw the value of a company not in the net present value of its standalone revenue, but in ways that it would increase their own company's scale, scope, and bargaining leverage with new data sources and entry into new markets. Every time an acquisition with an eye-popping price was announced, analysts would often ridicule the buyer for overpaying. But many on Sand Hill Road and Wall Street clearly understood what they were doing. More than a decade ago, Google bought a small 2-year-old company with little revenue called YouTube for $1.65 billion, more than $1 billion higher than the buyer's own valuation, according to some reporting. In 2012, Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion when it had $0 in sales. In 2014, Facebook bought WhatsApp for $19 billion, which had around $20 million in revenue the previous year. So what would the world look like if these acquisitions never happened? What if Google never bought Amazon? What if Amazon never bought Zappos? Perhaps put another way, what if MySpace or Friendster was able to buy up Facebook? No one knows the answers to these questions. But if we still believe in the promise of the digital economy, fewer barriers and gatekeepers, we need to keep asking ourselves whether certain business practices and merger activity are really promoting innovation or simply allowing incumbents to hold on to their reins. Second, we need to understand how new technology may be a threat to our civil rights and the goals of fairness we seek in our society. Large technology companies are carefully connecting dots about each of our lives, creating details about all of us. And how these detailed dossiers are used or misused is an open question, and it is opaque. Massive data collection is feeding algorithms that are making more decisions about our society, like which college a student might be admitted to, or whether an inmate gets parole. Mathematical models now help determine not only whether we can get a job or a loan or an apartment, but even whether we'll see a listing for one in the first place. Our civil rights and anti-discrimination laws had long sought to keep certain elements out of the equation. We put these laws into place with the goal of making our society more just and fair. And while machines crunching numbers might seem like it can take human bias out of the equation, it can't. More and more of us are asking what happens when bias is in the code. Are we making discrimination even harder to detect? Findings from academic studies and news reporting race and questions about One report found that men were showing more high-wage job listings much more often than women. If you search for black fraternities or black-sounding names, you're more likely to be shown ads for arrest records. According to a Reuters report, one company's recruiting AI seemed to reinforce preferences toward hiring men, downgrading graduates of women's colleges, and even resumes that listed the word women's. Scholars like Danielle Citron, Frank Piscali, and others have shined a light on how prediction engines work and raised important questions. How will we know the real reasons and rationale for a decision? Who is responsible and accountable for those decisions? The reality is we should never assume that algorithms will be free of bias. Instead, we need to own that reality and operate accordingly. We understand that people have biases, and we structure our laws and rights accordingly. And we'll need to think about how we do the same here. If we still want to move toward a society where each of us has equal opportunities, we need to investigate whether these models that are protected as trade secrets are helping or hurting that goal. Finally, we need to understand the interplay between the tech sector and democracy. Of course, technology is a way to incubate so many parts of our democracy. But lately there's been considerable attention to how social media and behavioral advertising could be weaponized to sway elections and impact politics, and I know that's part of our discussion later. Bots, fake accounts, and disinformation are now in our lexicon. This is important, but it is not the only intersection between technology and democracy. Speech and debate are the lifeblood of a democratic society. We need a competitive marketplace of diverse ideas and perspectives. And competition for ideas allows the best ones to emerge in ways that make a democracy flourish. A competitive marketplace of ideas requires news and journalism and books and authors. This competition helps keep those in power accountable. Another promise of the digital marketplace was giving those with ideas a new vehicle to reach others. Bloggers and podcasters don't require a permission slip from someone in New York or Washington, and that's a good thing. But with tech platforms serving as the gateway for many Americans to consume news and ideas, their increasing dominance has raised fears about journalism and publishing. These firms don't really employ journalists or create news content, but they've certainly had a dramatic impact. According to one calculation, there are half as many journalists working in newsrooms today compared to 2008. Now, for better or worse, news and journalism have long rested on an advertising market. And in recent years, advertising technology and behavioral targeting has reshaped advertising markets. The battle for advertising dollars is not waged solely on the basis of the quality or popularity of news content. It's increasingly driven by a contest on who has more data. Since those who have the data and not the content creator are capturing a big slice of the pie, there's less to go around to those who think up the big ideas. For local news outlets that lack the bargaining leverage, their struggles mean less transparency and accountability in town halls, police departments, and school districts all over America. It's not just news and journalism, it's books too. A few weeks ago, the Authors Guild reported that median writing-related earnings by American authors plummeted by 42% over the last decade. Even with the rise of ebooks and self-publishing, which should allow authors to cut out intermediaries and earn more, authors are reporting that the new marketplace leaves them with no choice but to accept low royalties. Many authors report that they just don't feel that they can get their fair share. We will never know the answer to many questions. Which books will never be written? Which ideas will never see the light of day? And what does this mean for our democratic society and values? We need to make sure that technology is propelling us and not restricting us. No single individual or entity has a monopoly when it comes to investigating and safeguarding us from these challenges and threats. And all across the globe, we're seeing how policymakers and enforcers are investigating and acting. Just recently, we saw how in India, new regulations create a structural separation between ownership of e-commerce marketplaces and ownership of goods sold on those marketplaces. We saw in Germany, competition enforcers halted quote-unquote exploitative terms and conditions allowing the dominant social media platform to collect and combine personal data. Here at home, it is clear that Congress, state attorneys general, federal law enforcement, media, academia, and citizens want answers. The Federal Trade Commission held a series of hearings that included discussions on platforms, artificial intelligence, nascent competitors, and vertical mergers. In addition to discussion, I think we can also play a role by gathering the facts and evidence across the industry. The FTC has a long history when it comes to conducting these industry-wide studies. In addition to our enforcement authority, the law allows the Commission to issue orders that require companies to hand over data and reports about their business practices. In recent history, we've used this to publish detailed studies on patent assertion entities and data brokers. And the insights are used by everyone with every perspective on every side of the debate. An industry-wide inquiry could uncover data and economic incentives related to online marketplaces and search, how data is used to create predictions, whether algorithms are leading to coordinated pricing effects, how ad tech is reshaping the market for content, and how incumbent firms evaluate the acquisition of nascent companies. Many are asking whether we need to reduce conflicts of interest and exclusionary conduct, increase transparency and auditability of algorithms, and advance other reforms. FTC fact gathering can help us answer some of these questions and lay the groundwork for all of us to seek more effective enforcement, legislation, regulations, and policies to protect our economy, society, and democracy. So let me conclude by reminding all of us that over the last century, competition policy and enforcement has created the conditions for scores of startups to innovate and flourish. And while we often focus and seek to measure the costs of action and regulation, we should also be asking ourselves about the cost of inaction and whether we are missing out on the innovation and progress that come with a competitive marketplace. Thank you.
Rohit's remarks beautifully tee up the discussion we want to have. And let me start high level, which underscores what a great Silicon Flatirons panel. So we have an FTC commissioner with a background in business. We do have a lawyer who has served in government and the private sector with distinction. Grace's background includes both in the White House, in the legislature, in a law firm. Really a great friend of Silicon Flatirons here. Patty Limerick is iconic. She has been the historian of Colorado. She is the founder and the moving force behind the Center for the American West. Her works on the American West and history of the West are terrific, and she has added so much to our discussions as a humanitarian perspective. Finally, Balaguer is now the CEO of Liberty Latin America with a distinguished career as a technologist and a longtime friend of mine in Silicon Flatiron. So let me start high level with this point of narrative. The image that Jack Waters had was one of Schumpeterian disruption. Jack's response to some of what Commissioner Chopra said is, oh, Sears was a great dominant platform in its day, and it's gone. The history of the railroads has an interesting set of challenges where we look at different abuses, including the famous issues around Standard Oil, which actually involve Standard Oil using the railroads to its strategic advantage, begging the question of what we learned from that history. And part of what Commissioner Chopra just underscored is 20 years ago, a lot of the cyber law scholarship that was then called was incredibly optimistic about disintermediation and democratization. And it was viewed as the information age more in terms of nirvana, but today dystopian fears like Minority Report, some of the artificial intelligence concerns that Rohit mentioned, are actually on the tip of people's tongues. So my question to each of you, as you think about these dueling narratives, how do you reconcile what truths lay within each of them? One is a great narrative of Schumpeterian creative destruction, disintermediation, innovation, benefits to consumers, benefits to democracy. The other is more fears of dominant platforms that control our lives in ways we may not even know. Fallon, you've lived through this information revolution. How do you come to terms with those dueling narratives?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on the panel. I think you have to look at who the winners and losers are, at least from where we stand today. And if you look at the constituents here, you've got the governments, you've got businesses, and you've got end users. One can argue governments for the longest time, depending on where they sit, either like or hate social networks. For the most part, if you were in the Middle East in the last 10 years, you hated social networks. In the United States in the last 10 years, until about 2 years ago, you loved social networks if you were a government, right? So you've got that one entity. So governments, I think, today universally view social networks as a threat to themselves, as well as a loss of revenue, because these networks, and not just social networks, but the internet platforms in general, have taken taxation from productive tax-paying businesses into non-tax-paying verticals. So that's one entity. Second, businesses. Businesses in general view all these platforms as dangerous because they've monopolized payment systems, they've monopolized data, they've monopolized inventory, ad inventory, they've monopolized technology. The tech to do artificial intelligence requires tremendous amount of capital and scale. And they've also monopolized capital access. I mean, you're talking about close to $1 trillion of valuations for each one of these companies. It's just sucked out, capital from a lot of other businesses. So that's another constituent. The third one is the users. Users see this as all great. I got free stuff. It has never been this good, where I can just type in something, I get answers. If I want to buy something, it's just a click. It's the best time for users. However, it's a short-lived best time, because I think users are starting to realize the dangers of having their data being exposed. So that's how I see it in general.
Patty, you are our expert on narrative as well as on railroads and that history. What lessons do you learn, or what questions do you ask?
I shall just engage in wild acts of oversimplification in the next few minutes here. I'm going to just, next minute really. So I'm thinking, this is a little like time travel. I thought it would be interesting to visit the late 19th century, and now I'm kind of here because in westward expansion, there were many enterprises, many of them very heavily supported by the federal government, and there was a general, not universal, but some society-wide cheering. Oh, heavens, we've got railroads, we've got mines, we've got logging, we've got freighting, we've got freighting and stagecoaches that spur off the railroads. Oh, goodness, look at all this access that we have. So we had that, and so there's a lot of cheering, and then pretty fast there was the, what we got here. And the life cycle of companies is really interesting. Most Western towns started very strongly with that. This town has been born. This town is growing. Not really saying at some point this town will be in old age and will perish. But it is an interesting problem, life cycle. So, but I do, and I don't want to say that life cycles should govern our thinking about institutions, but it is a pattern in Western American history to see companies that emerge with vitality and innovation that turn defensive and prickly and power hugging in ways that happen pretty fast from the innovation era. And so the fact that it seemed like the tech people were quite young for a while, and now they seem to be a little bit more middle-aged, it's kind of an interesting, well, there it is happening in the leadership of that. So I guess I would say we are in, not in any way a reenactment of the late 19th century, but just as the period of expansion into the West in the mid-19th century was exhilarating and seemed to fall under the category progress, pretty soon the reckoning came. People started talking about a timber famine, that we would have taken the most forested continent, extraordinary resources, and left it with a lacking supply of timber. So all kinds of concerns. We have had mines. We have left abandoned mines. So that reckoning of what have we done and what will, I mean, this is where your talk is so, right, okay, so now we have these consequences. We had benefits. There's no denying the benefits. But now we have the what will be the intelligent regulation and the enforcement process that can help us with that reckoning. Not to erase the benefits in the least, but to reckon with that. And I guess I would say there's a lot more options than there might seem. One of the great things about history is that you do see passed up alternatives. And so you see things like that I don't think are in people's stereotypes of the West. The first laws to protect the bison, to try to preserve the buffalo, those were in the 1870s. One bill passed in 1874. It's way out of the time period, you'd think. So I think we can see our predecessors as saying, take it on. take it on, and I'll just use this as a teaser, maybe use it as an occasion to really do some bedrock thinking about federalism and the allocation of authority between state, federal, and local, and also think about the extraordinary power of public relations and what they call in the oil and gas industry the social license to operate, to promote better self-regulation and better best practices and so on. That is a backstory of the reaction. I'm actually going to end here. The reaction and reckoning with the costs and injuries and troubles of westward expansion. The outcome of that was a lot of backstage maneuvering hidden in archives. The progressives give public speeches in the late 19th century and the early 20th century about regulating industry and pushing industry back and making sure it does not harm citizens. In the archives, there's a lot of correspondence between company leaders and those progressive activists, with the company leaders basically saying, you're going to have to help us. Our reputations are not good, and really our only hope is if you will help us restore our credibility and trust. And again, that's not out in the public record very much, but it is there in the archives. So I guess I'm not saying history repeats itself, because it does not. Every situation is very different, but history leaves Hansel and Gretel-like crumbs of inspiration behind it, of alternatives not taken, of efforts that were taken but may or may not be in our minds. Oh, I'm stopping, for heaven's sake. You can't stop a historian from just shattering on.
History may not repeat itself, but it's said it often rhymes.
Yes, and it often gets over communicated in these situations. So that was a TMI moment, and I'll control myself here. I'm under control.
Building off of Ballin and Patty's point, let me ask you, because we've now had 3 sets of governmental institutions mentioned internationally, both other countries, international coordination, nationally, and then state governments. You've had a perspective to see it all of them. How do you see, from a governmental challenge, how do we take this narrative on board, things like the FTC studies, and navigate policy in this fast-moving area?
That was really cool.
Don't encourage me. Don't encourage me.
That's the idea, Patty, actually.
I didn't hear it.
It was really cool. And I love the idea that history rhymes. I think that's absolutely right. Just to go back to the original framing of your question of the 2 narratives, I mean, you know that we're all thinking it's both, right? We all think that it is actually both. It is both the creative destruction, and at the same time, it's also a perpetual fear of what these new sort of overarching technologies will do in our lives and how they will impact and reshape our lives. And I think that's where policy fits in, is basically to figure out how those narratives will affect each other and which of those narratives need to be sort of the dominant at which time, et cetera. And just as Patty had mentioned, I think that's what policymakers do, and it's ever, we're ever balancing, or they are ever, because I have no idea what I am at this point, they are ever balancing between those 2 sort of narratives. And the same solution does not work constantly throughout you can't always impose structural remedies, you can't always impose behavioral remedies, and you can't always count on one thing setting up for the next. In this instance, you have situations where the kinds, I think, Rohit, your keynote was very helpful in sort of teeing up the differences in the way, you just beautifully sort of set up the changes in the way we deal with data and the amounts of data that we're swimming in at this point, and why that changes the way companies work, and why that changes the way companies compete, and why that changes the way companies are able to monetize what they do. And in some instances, we may think large can actually be helpful, right? Large can actually allow for certain things. For example, I don't know that it necessarily made sense for a smaller company to go into content, but then you have folks like Amazon and Netflix who are finding ways to start really beginning to compete in that and make a significant dent in some of those particular sort of strategies. So I think as when we're in a situation where we have so many more, I think, large competitors, large industries that sort of that need a massive amounts of scale to actually really compete and actually be efficient in the market, you do need places like federal governments and global governments to sort of step in and sort of be the primary regulators. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for the more on-the-ground sort of type of work that needs to happen. Certainly, as you're pointing out, there are roles for state governments, and the roles on federalism, I think, will go ever back and forth as we try to figure out what the balance is. That's a pretty general answer at this point, but I guess as we get more into specifics, we can start speaking about where more of these choices have to be made.
Wrote on these narratives, how do you think about it?
Well, I agree with Grace that there's not an answer. There's an importance of thinking about the prism, the whole thing. I mean, the one thing that I didn't speak about, but I feel very deeply, is that the way in which we are advancing, particularly with the aggregation of data, what we're seeing, I think, particularly in China, is a very different vision of the use of data and the aggregation of data in ways that I think are really just completely different than we would want our society to progress toward. And I think there's a question then of can we really solve this through economic models and with technicians, or are we going to have to consider some things that are really hard to measure? I mean, I think in the last panel, this question of wanting to know what the concerns are and what the evidence is, but then raising, what if it's not measurable? Does that mean it's zero? And I think that's the challenge that we have to face, that this is going to be decided not just by a calculation, but also by our values too.
I want to go back to Balin, because you, in your describing what's happened, talked about a trend towards dominance. And David Clark and others picked this up in the earlier panel. How do we think about the emergence of dominant platforms vis-a-vis the economic ideal of, let's call it even, workable competition? So there are some contexts, video game consoles, for example, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony remaining viable alternative platforms that have some disciplining effect on each other. In other environments, at best, we seem to see the Facebook replacing the MySpace. Rohit had a very interesting suggestion that buying up potential competition may be part of what aids and abets that dominance. What's your theory of the case? In this world we have over these information platforms develop, will we see rivalry, or do we see successive companies? How do you see it?
Well, it's really hard to compare these verticals. Like the gaming industry, they derive their economic value from the consumer. So you're selling something, a good set of goods. Some of these platforms that we're discussing here do not derive their economic value from the end consumer. They derive it from your advertising inventory and a whole bunch of other things. And so therefore you see the gaming industry, you see the mobile phone industry, the Apples and the Androids. I mean, they are just bludgeoning each other. The other thing you see with these industries, those verticals as well, the profit motivation is there. And then you look at these other verticals like Amazon and Netflix and all these other guys, Google, et cetera, where the profit motivation is not as high because the economic value that they get from the capital infused in them is unbelievable. So if you look at the last 5 years, I would argue that the regulators have been kind of asleep at the wheel. When they look at horizontal integration, they spend more time on the Sprint T-Mobile, on the AT&T, Time Warner. They spend a significant amount of time on old school type horizontal integration and nothing on when Facebook bought Instagram or WhatsApp. I mean, zero, right? Even though the valuations are pretty high. And so one can say today, the ship has sailed on that. So now what do you do? Back to the three constituents, governments are terrified now with these platforms. Businesses, I can tell you, are terrified of these platforms because as soon as Amazon says they're going to go into any vertical, immediately value destruction happens to the incumbents. The only constituent that's not terrified are the end users because they derive so much frictionless service. But there will come a day when the end users will also be terrified, and only then something's going to happen.
Rohit, let me go to you first on this. So to add another example, some people said, well, Amazon buying Whole Foods, we should be terrified about this for reasons that, again, Balin talked to. But from an antitrust perspective, Amazon had no market share in grocery or food distribution. So from a traditional antitrust standpoint, spending zero amount of time or close to that looks to be appropriate. Do you think there's some project that we have to be rethinking some of these antitrust tools to face what is in the changed economy? And how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to comment on any individual deal, but one thing that I'm hoping is that antitrust law is a subset of competition policy. There are many other levers to use outside of the antitrust laws to promote competition, and antitrust law, it's certainly a bedrock of it. But we've been going through these hearings, and there's a debate about whether the existing tools and approaches and the way the law has developed, does it essentially create too many false positives? And does it lead to under-enforcement? And what is the consequences of that? So I don't think we know the answer. I'm not really sure how to get to that answer unless we actually gather some facts and evidence. One of the things that is important is, it's been mentioned often there's just not the data there. To the extent the government can collect it and can put it out there for people to be able to argue on each side, we need to do that. My sense is that, just serving since May, is that there is likely an under-enforcement problem, and that we are less willing to challenge the close calls because the way the law has developed. I've raised some questions about whether we need to be thinking about other forms of ways to develop the law, including competition rulemaking, and we've heard a lot about that. So things are going to change, I just don't know, but we need to gather facts and evidence to figure out how to surgically do it.
So Grace, a couple of themes there. One is, how can our institutions gather facts and evidence to make policy? And second, how do we think about this trade-off between the false positives versus false negatives? You acted and you're like, ooh, I guess it wasn't the smartest thing to try to stop this merger that now looks like it was irrelevant. Or, ooh, I guess we didn't look at this other issue and we probably should have. How do you think about those two sets of issues?
It's interesting. So I kind of want to run off on a little bit of a tangent, and just posit that under the traditional antitrust analysis, the Amazon Whole Foods example sort of doesn't really raise questions and is, according to some, a false, negative maybe, or a true negative. But if you look at, I think one of the things that we are concerned about, I think, is just, the amount of power that Amazon just plain has, just because it already gathers, attracts so much, has such an immense user base, has such a huge, broad reach. And to the extent that I think business models are changing significantly, not just to incorporate your traditional methods of distribution, production, et cetera. It's also turning into very much a data game for all businesses all the way around. It's not just about sort of what you produced, whether you make software, produce content. It is, what do you know about your buyer? What do you know about your competitors' buyers? What do you know, what do you know about the end users, et cetera? And to that extent, I think that is where I think our uneasiness starts to really, that seems to be where the uneasiness is located. That sense that there is going to be this unused, maybe this latent element that we don't know how to deal with just yet. And I think that is what we're sort of pinpointing in this Whole Foods and Amazon deal. And I think that happens generally across the board when you look at any large company, which becomes a new competitor in a new space, has zero market share, and you question whether or not what they have in the way of assets really will be set straight over into to create more competition in this market, right, which could be a great thing. The Netflix, Amazon content example that I cited has been a huge boon for consumers. Or whether what they have, this sort of increased amount of data that they've been gathering, will turn into something more, I suppose, ominous and more menacing. And I'm not sure what the answer there is yet, but I think the more we can actually be very, and to go back to Rohit's point about gathering facts and evidence, I think it is about gathering facts and evidence, but it is also about the analysis of what we do with that. So the more we can be more articulate about what it is that causes us uneasiness and gives us pause, and actually we can sort of state what the potential harm and outcomes of that particular harm are, I think the closer we can be to actually figuring out what we do about that.
So Patty, let's go to part 2 of your story, which is these regulatory institutions develop things like railroad commissions, public utility commissions. What do we learn from that history that might speak to this moment as well?
Well, there is a thing called a captured agency, and that happens, especially maybe in federal land management, the creation of the federal land management agencies to, in some ways or other, have more thoughtful regulatory practices. That didn't work out so well if the local ranchers were the grazing board that controlled that. So there is a way in which the creation of an agency can just turn out to be an empowering for the forces that you had before that. I do want to say, as a humanities person, I have never successfully measured anything in my life. So I am a very fresh presence here. And so I guess I'm thinking how much of this is in the subjectivity zone, because in terms of yes, there was the reckoning, yes, a bunch of agencies and commissions got to exist, yes, they soon lost the trust of the public, or pretty soon lost the trust of the public, even if they were born in the optimism of the public. So that's really complicated, and that's why I write sympathetic columns in the Denver Post about how hard it is to be a federal employee. They bring tears to people's eyes, those columns, because they're so heartfelt. It's really hard to do that, because you are dealing with this incredibly difficult, these are the expectations we have for these agencies, and within seconds of their creation, they can be disillusioning and disappointing to people, and that's something that just always has to be danced with. I do think it is possible to say that monopoly and oligopoly create wake-up calls to the American people and to their representatives in legislature and in executive branch places. So that's the cheeriest way to say, but I must say the word dominance is harder to define than platform. I mean, if you sent me off for a time in the lobby to define platform, I could come back sooner than I could come back with a clear definition of dominance, which has colorful implications if you think about it too. So there's some really interesting issues about wrestling with that, how much of it has to be blatant and obvious, how much of it is subtle and therefore all the more powerful because it's not wielding of muscle in public ways. I mean, it's a very interesting term in that. Anyway, I do want to just come back to the subjectivity in responding to your question is huge. So, for instance, you're saying at some point, fascinating, and I think probably right, that at some point the end users have to be, not have to be, but will be terrified. So then, this is too fun, I think, well, we need an algorithm for when to be terrified. Because that's very difficult to assess, to just be thinking, well, I'm kind of scared, taking my pulse, not that scared yet, but to find a way in which we could think that through. And what I love about the word algorithm, I did not know 15 or 20 years ago I was going to love the word algorithm, but we have fallen for each other since then, because it is a word in which humanities and engineers and scientists have to be in relationship with each other, because as our speakers have been saying, that's where we were going to be free of human bias, but then in fact that gets into the code. So I'm delighted that we can all be thinking in those terms. I think I'm most struck by how more explicit and productive we could be looking at the past in looking at the forms of regulation and enforcement that do come into play with very dynamic situations and being as nimble and agile as we can be in saying, this was the intention of the policy we created, this is where that is not proving out. That's where, I mean, what the land managers call adaptive management. You think, well, we'll help that little spotted owl, and then the spotted owl just keeps dying. And you think, we're trying to help you, would you stop dying, for heaven's sake? So to just have that adaptive management, to say, what went wrong there? We had a policy, it had a goal, we didn't get there. That's what I hope we could do, which particularly with the late 19th century, early 20th century, but even more so the environmental laws of the 1960s and 1970s and what they turned out to mean, the difficulty that if you try to say, I know I seem to be going into a different area, but I think it fits here. If you say, oh, the Endangered Species Act, that turned out to have all kinds of frictions and complications we didn't see. Well, could we revise it? No, because we go to the mat on all sides. Oh, don't touch a hair on that because then we'll have to, other people will just erase it and so on. If we could have a reasoned form of discussing when a regulation got to the goal and when it went somewhere else, which is not, it's probably maybe more the rule than the exception. So the narrative holds that reckonings are good and important innovations come out of that, but those innovations could be subject to much more deliberation once they're in play to say, is that what we wanted?
Let me ask a final question to the panel, then get to the audience, and this picks up where Patty ended. Rohit hit this point about social media platforms and democracy. Balance picked it up as well. One could say the following: the polarization and the Twitterization of discourse is making it harder to have the sort of deliberate reflection that Patty's saying we need to develop adaptive management solutions to these sorts of platforms. Agree or disagree, and comment. Alan first.
Agree conditionally. I don't think you need measurable and algorithms to determine when someone is terrified. I mean, this is the first time in a long time, I've been coming to this for a while, that we're not talking about net neutrality in this conference. But one can argue there was no measurements there, and people were terrified about net neutrality. The day will come when consumers, today, if you send an email to a friend and you say you're flying to San Francisco on Gmail, pretty soon you'll get notification of flights and weather in San Francisco, right?
Yeah. Right.
If you were having a phone conversation and you said you were traveling to San Francisco and suddenly you see something, you'd be terrified, right? But you're not as terrified yet on email because it's somewhat useful. Yeah, the weather in San Francisco, I was looking for it. But what if that information is used and gave you something else that was a lot more scarier? And that day could happen. So when this thing turns, when consumers decide to turn on these platforms, it will happen very quickly. Now, on the flip side, I would also argue the thing that worries me most as a businessman and a technologist is that these platforms actually is a source of pride for this country. I mean, our innovation and technology in the United States is far superior than the rest of the world. But China is catching up. So we have to be very careful while the ship has sailed that we don't do too much harm to our innovation and technology, where the Baidus and the Alibabas and the WeChats suddenly start dominating the internet.
Patty?
Well, these invitations from Phil, this is a term that we don't use much anymore, but they are psychedelic, and they are just really like, good Lord, it never would have come into my mind to think such a thing. But so I had never thought of this so directly. I guess I could have. I thought of it in subtle and indirect ways, but there is no golden age when it comes to really civilized, productive, respectful discourse in the United States. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams hated each other so bitterly they didn't speak to each other for 17 years and so on. So to get nostalgic for I'm not sure that there was ever an amplification of that that's quite at the level we have now. But in the 19th century West, terms were very common in use. Absolutely dreadful forms of expression about other human beings were mainstream and conventional and common. And then, I'm thinking, and that continued in not just the American West, but the American South for quite a while. And then somewhere around the mid-20th century, some changes occurred where those forms of disrespectful public expression became less celebrated and even became silenced. And that was a kind of a pleasant interlude. But that's what I'm wondering, if that might be, this is the thing I would not have thought of without these conferences, are we first getting a little bit drawn into nostalgia for the days, where the 1850s that led to the Civil War? You can really get very sentimental about those days. So maybe cut back on that, but also recognize that that interlude, that was maybe 30 years where we were going to try to speak to each other in polite and respectful ways. And as if we have that figured out, how to conduct ourselves when we are materially present and using our vocal cords to denounce each other and to express scorn and dislike and hatred for each other. So we haven't got that down for public occasions when we're doing very well today. I just want to say everyone looks very good natured today. It's lovely. But many other situations, we're not clear. What is this thing called hate speech? Where does it constrain free expression by the shouted word, not the... So I'm wondering if maybe we should have a different form of periodization of American history where we can see that this was the norm to see other people in scornful ways and to draw really intense us and them boundaries and to condemn the people on the other side. That was a very respected practice in many circles for a really long time. Then we did have this, I don't know if it's 30 or 40 years, 45 years. I'm happy it was sort of my prime time on the planet. That was nice. But why did we think that was permanent? And so I guess I'm saying some of this is about the technology, but it's also just that something that we thought, well, we've turned that corner. This is really, we should have stayed terrified, actually, of the fact that it could resurge, that it could be back. So that is my main thought. And then I did just have a thing I wanted to say about Neville speaking of this simultaneous translation thing. Way beyond that, just that you have the technology doing what in the American West did not happen for centuries. Every time Indian people and white people met, there was a person, if they were going to do anything significant in the way of trade or negotiation, there would be a person who was the interpreter and the translator, the only person who spoke both languages. And that person was the hinge. Anytime anybody of any ethnic or nationality group met with others, that interpreter was the person. So for me, as a Western American historian, when he was talking about the interpreter and translator, we may not be needing that. And yet, the interpreters and the translators were a mixed group of people. Some of them were very flawed. Sometimes they were the essential moderator at keeping people from violent forms of expression. So I'm getting nostalgic again a little bit, but it's really, and often they were people of mixed heritage, people of two different nationalities in their parentage. So they were interesting figures. So I began to mourn for them and grieve for them an hour and a half ago when they were going to be supplanted by this 5G thing. So let's just...
I'm forgetting what movie it was, where someone goes on this long rant, and then the translator says, he disagrees.
Good point.
And Rohit, you worried a little about that. You're talking about what AI can do with discrimination. Do you think that the new media institutions of today are changing discourse, making our democracy in a tougher place to actually address the concerns of these institutions? Is that something?
Well, sure, but I always err on the side of more speech than less speech. I don't live in a country that doesn't have these things and that doesn't allow these things. So
you're not moving to China, in other words.
I mean, speech is important, and there's going to be consequences of it. I think the question is, to what extent does the controller of the public square discourse, to what extent can they put a thumb on the scale?
Yeah.
So, what types of messages get through, and what is the implication of that for fair democratic system?
Grace knows well. Section 230 says, you're a platform, anything that's said on your platform, you're not responsible. You don't have to worry about what you curate or take down. That has become under increasing discussion. What would you say, either Patty has the sort of hope for self-regulatory adaptive management institutions or any governmental oversight? How do we begin to think about this public square notion when the public square is not at all owned by the public, it's owned by private companies?
Right. I think that's a great question, and it's very difficult, I think. So one of the things that I was thinking about when you were asking this question was the fact that, social media has been great, and everyone says social media is great because it connects us all. It's not. It's annoying. I've learned so much more about people that I don't care about or actually don't want to know. I have seen Twitter is you know, I've seen too much on Twitter, and I think all of you might feel the same way. So it's just, you just realize there's this rush of information coming at you, and I think Facebook and Twitter and all of these other places do their best. This is the rudimentary sort of beginning of trying to customize to your preference what they think you want to see, and also the ads, but you know. So if we get to a point where AI actually does get to this, and this is something my husband asked me that, you know, in my role as a policymaker generally, please just to make sure that the killer robots don't come to be. Right, exactly, right. And I have to say, and he's sitting back there laughing at me. I have to say, I'm okay with the robots. I am, for one, I'm going to welcome my robot overlords because data is increasingly everything. And I think I mentioned that when I talked a little bit about the companies becoming more and more data companies. Data becomes so much more integral to all of their plans, regardless of whether or not regardless of what they actually produce, do, or whatever else they do. And it's also become increasingly important to us as consumers, as social beings, as just it shapes who we are because of the amounts of data that we're now swimming in and can see. I mean, social media is just one of those options, and we are going to need AI in order to be able to make sense of all of this. We are going to need, we're all going to be involved in assisted thinking at some point. And that's, I think that's what's in the future. Now, this may be further off than the next 4 years, or 5 years, but I think that we're already seeing it in the filtering of our results, in the filtering of our social media feeds, and I think it's going to become more prevalent in all ways that we consume information. And the problem is, do we get an AI, as you've pointed out, in the way the algorithms are built, that actually makes us better human beings, or just more who we wanted, or more of what we just want, which isn't necessarily better. And then who gets to decide what better really is, right? So to the extent that, I am very concerned about, you know, putting in place regulations that would stint the amount of data that is permitted to be collected and disseminated. But I am also very worried about a world in which there isn't some sort of clear guideline on how to be better about those kinds of practices. Because like it or not, I think the amount of data that we experience are just going to increase. And whether, to go back to the Section 230 question, whether the public square keeper, the Facebooks, whether they are in the best position really to be the best gatekeepers, or whether, you know, we as individuals ought to be better gatekeepers, or if there's some other sort of structure that needs to be put into place. I'm not sure what the right answer there is, but we are at the very beginning of this, and it's good that we're thinking about this and talking about this now. And hopefully, collectively, with this incredible brain trust that Phil has accumulated over these years, somebody will be able to figure it out.
Speaking of ideas for students to write papers on, we can look back now at spam, which was an early internet policy challenge. People don't generally complain about how Google and Gmail have addressed spam, because it's not the challenge that it once was. Whether, and if at all, the canned spam law played any constructive role in that is certainly open to debate. And so it's an interesting case study. Look forward to someone taking it on. Speaking of students, we'd like to hear from you and give you the first question or two. Not afraid to call on people either. All right, we have a ringer here. All right.
Hi, I'm Nagendra. I'm in the interdisciplinary telecom program here at CU. My question here would be pointing out to Commissioner Chopra. That was an amazing keynote. I really enjoyed every topic you have spoken about and what you have discussed, and especially the bias in the algorithms, which is not easy to detect, and it's definitely something we have to address. And one more thing you have pointed out is how we'll be able to preserve democracy in the technology space, or even the applications whichever is being developed. So in that aspect, oftentimes from what I have seen, I think it's more often we are reactive in the sense that once the technology is in place, it's being used by people, and then we see some issue with it, and then we react to it and come up with policies. And I understand that it's not easy to be proactive in that aspect because it's not easy to assume how the technology will evolve over time. Based on your experience, I'm just curious to know, how do you think the policies will evolve over time to understand if there is a new technology coming up, what might be the impacts of it, or how we should be able to handle it better just based on the experience?
I mean, impossible question to answer. So, I mean, here's what I would say. And I'll just give an analogy from a different context that I'm deeply familiar with. So, innovation in financial products and capital markets had hugely consequential effects on society. It decided who was going to be able to get investment dollars, who was going to get a mortgage, and what price they were going to pay. So naturally, there's a hesitation to put a stop to something before it starts. But where I take the view is, you know, particularly when you're developing infrastructure for a market to prosper, you want to create the conditions in that infrastructure and the policy landscape so that entry barriers remain low, and that there's very clear rules of the road for everybody. Because I think the challenge you get is when the big players don't feel that they can do cost-benefit analysis when it comes to complying with the law. That's where you get trouble. You get a two-sided system. But developing new protections before new technology comes, or before new diseases come, or before new consumer products come, it's impossible, unfortunately, I think.
All right. Other questions? Let's start in the back with Gideon first, and then we'll move up.
So thank you very much for a fantastic and highly entertaining panel. So two things. I don't know if the world is better, if life is great at the moment or not so great, but I think that the key question is, are there any legal interventions or regulatory interventions that can make it better? Because if not, I mean, we can just spin our wheels for as long as we want. I love those conferences, don't get me wrong, I'm an academic myself, but I don't think that we're making any real progress in terms of providing any basis, and I don't want to go into the measurable, immeasurable debate for doing something. Now, the second point is that the world is changing. I almost feel like, you know, I can hear my parents speak about those teenagers with the long hair now, because our concepts of what, you know, what life should be like are very different from what our kids experience, right, in their own use of technology. And actually, all this trend toward personalization, the usage of big data to make everything highly personalized, as you guys mentioned, I mean, I'm not saying anything new, and they measure everything all the time, right? Our attention, what we like, what we don't like. It is what makes them so successful. And if we continue to kind of think, well, should we do this or do that? At some point, and maybe that point is in the past, it will be irrelevant, I think. Please, thank you.
So, fair question to everyone. Is there a single regulatory or public policy intervention at this point you would recommend?
I have a quick thought on that. And again, I commute into so many different areas. So I would say there is a choice to go the way that matters have gone in the oil and gas world, regulatory world, or you can go the way that it's gone in the water world. And I'm going to overstate and oversimplify, but if you like, in this area, you can get the public, and I take your point that they don't really need an algorithm, that there will come a time of saying this is going poorly, then you could have very heated, very rancorous ballot initiatives. And people could put a lot of money into that, and it could be very prickly and very polarizing and so on. So that's one way to go. That's the oil and gas scenario. The other is to go where the water people went, and this is really my question about, is this even imaginable? Yes, people still sue each other over water. That's why we have so many water lawyers in Colorado. That's still thriving. And a lot of that has been supplanted by negotiation. There's a lot of watershed coalitions, stakeholder meetings. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, he didn't say it, but supposed to have said water is, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. well, that he didn't say that, and it needs to be revised for our time, which is whiskey is for drinking, that has not changed, and water is for brewing coffee to be served at stakeholder meetings. So that is a route, and I tried to think if this is a situation that is susceptible to that. I don't quite know who you would. A watershed coalition, you can figure out more easily who's involved and who has. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's pretty clear who has a stake. But is there an option to actually cut back on the litigation route and or the top-down administrative regulation or the legislative thing, and say, well, who's got a stake in this, and could we chat with each other and see if. I mean, it's just a thought. I don't know.
No, it's an area that I think is incredibly promising. I've written a little bit on this. You think about something like the LEED building standard, where governments have said we need more of this, and it has catalyzed and supported private sector-led efforts and investment that drives change. And in the internet world, you could take something like advertising around human trafficking. Like, how do we help drive change? It doesn't necessarily require legislation or ballot initiatives, but you can see what I have seen in the water world as well, collaborative problem solving.
Yeah. And also in the internet world, right? I mean, there were NTIA, for example, hosted multi-stakeholder meetings that were fairly successful in early privacy discussions, I think, back in 2009, mainly primarily dealing with online behavioral advertising. You saw IAB put out self-regulating guidelines, which had mixed results, I think. You see that in the cyber world, where you have NIST sort of framework for determining it, for best practices, and et cetera. Again, Professor, we're already in the world of big data, and I think if you stymie the flow of data, you will never get to the point where you actually have algorithms that are accurate and clear enough, and I don't think that any one of us wants that to stop. But I think having the clear dialogue, maintaining the clear dialogue between stakeholders, and continuing to involve, I think, regulators as part of that discussion is one place to start. Again, I think doing anything more drastic, and of course, this is the Republican talking. Doing anything more drastic, I think, threatens to some degree innovation. Although, I want to quote Gail Slater at the State of the Net, who looked at the question of Section 230 liability and Sesta-Fosta's passage, and she said, sure, there are trade-offs. You have innovation, investment, et cetera, on one side, and then on the other side, you have dead children. So 97 senators decided that was a pretty easy trade-off to make. And I think when you have situations like that, that you get clearer, I think, that there might be clearer choices. But generally speaking, on a framework basis, I think you want to approach this slowly and cautiously.
I think reactively, sure, but proactively, there shouldn't be any more horizontal or vertical integrations with these. I mean, the thought of Amazon buying Netflix or anything like that, the government should be very clear to say, not really going to happen.
I think something that we haven't talked about enough is that if you talk to a lot of venture capital firms, private equity firms, they have changed the way in which, or slowly over time, are now thinking about allocating capital in ways that, where their top question is, will we be able to sell this to one of the incumbents? And that means that the nature of enterprises that get capital are going to be different. You may not get the same allocation of investment to ones who are truly seeking that kind of Schumpeterian disruption. And I hope that we always have markets that are promoting that kind of challenge, rather than saying, I'm going to build a business with the hopes of selling to one of the big guys.
Right.
Gideon, do you have a response you wanted to make on that? So the good news about this panel is we want to stimulate questions, ideas for the whole conference. And the bad news is it does have to end in time for lunch. We are at that time. Again, I would encourage all of our professionals in the audience to talk to students and vice versa. And let me thank our panelists for a great discussion.